Good morning. Today is the 13th day of Iyar, the 21st of May, and we're going to be looking at the third reading of Parshat Behar. The third reading is about the blessing that God will give on the sixth year before a sabbatical year, so that the produce of the sixth year is enough for, here it says, for 3 years. It has to be enough for the sixth year, for the sabbatical year when there's nothing grown. By the way, before we continue explaining three years of blessing, it's very important to know that if you leave a field that has been worked and has been growing thanks to sowing seeds for 6 years, if you leave it 1 year without working it, it will still grow quite a serious amount on the next year, even if you don't do anything at all. So I don't know what the exact statistic is, but it runs anywhere between 50 and 75%. So there's actually a lot that grows by itself. This is known as sfichin in the Talmud, in the Mishnah, and it means the natural growth of the field. Of course, it has to be a field that's been worked, that's been agriculturally developed for a number of years before. In any case, so the sixth year, when you sow and you reap, the produce will be enough for 3 years, for the sixth, for the seventh, and for most of the eighth, because you won't be sowing again until after the rainy season. You can't do it before, or sometime in the winter you can start, and so until sometime in Nisan, Iyar, like around this time, you'd have to have produce that you already collected in the sixth year, plus, again, this natural growth. There's a lot to be discussed about what the meaning of these two things are, because as you understand, in the Torah, the agriculture is a very important metaphor for many of the spiritual things that people go through. So there are developments in us that are dependent on our work, but there's also things that grow by themselves. Usually, if you leave a child alone, they pretty much grow by themselves. There's certain things that do grow by themselves, and some of them are actually considered to be of greater value than things that we work on. But let's leave that for now, and we want to focus on the very last two verses. Actually, on the second to last verse, we're looking at Leviticus 25, verse 23. If you remember, we discussed this idea that you can't really sell a plot of land in the land of Israel, because all the land is supposed to be divided between the residents. And once the land is divided, as it was in the time of Joshua, then the land is meant to be held onto by the family that received it as an inheritance for all perpetuity. And even if they sell it, they're only selling it for a limited amount of time. So when the Jubilee year comes around, the 50th year, all the land returns back to its inheritor owners, the original owners of the land. There's a whole question about what the status is today, because if you know a little bit about Jewish history, even though the land was divided in the first temple period, it was not divided again in the second temple period. In fact, in the second temple period, the meaning of the tribes was completely different, if there was any meaning to it. There was some meaning to it with respect to the temple, but there's no meaning to it, as far as I know, in terms of where different tribes settled. In fact, the whole tribal affiliation was almost gone during the second temple. We certainly don't have it today. So there's a whole question about whether we have to go back to the Joshua type of dividing the land up between the families. It seems from the end of Ezekiel that won't be the case, even when the temple is rebuilt, that the land may be divided among the tribes, but based on a completely different system. And it's not even clear that the tribes will serve the same function that they used to serve in the first temple period. But again, Leviticus 25:23. In Hebrew it says, "Va'aretz lo timacher litzmitut, Ki li haaretz ki gerim v'toshavim atem imadi. And in English, the land must not be sold in perpetuity, for the land belongs to me, says God. For you are sojourners and temporary residents dwelling with me on my land. This is a very important verse and has to be understood correctly, because you can get all kinds of strange things out of this verse. What is he saying? He's saying that you can't sell the land perpetuity because God has decided how to divide it. The division in the time of Joshua was based both on prophecy and on a raffle of sorts, plus what was also logical. Three things needed to happen. But once God has divided the land in a certain way, and in general, even if the land is not divided, but you have to give it back at the end of the Jubilee, at the end of 50 years, you have to return it to its rightful owner. People get attached to the physical possessions that we have in this world. And what this verse is actually saying is you should have possessions. We're not against attachment, but don't feel that you are the owner. Meaning that this is a suggestion for how to go through life. And as in many things that the Torah talks about, especially the way that the Hasidic thought about these things goes, when you think about something like possessions, you need to have a complex approach to it. In fact, you have to have a paradoxical approach to it. On the one hand, I'm responsible for my possession. I need to take care of it. It's my responsibility. I need to develop it if it needs to be developed. If it's a piece of land, I can't leave it empty. If it's a car, I have to take care of it, take it to the shop and whatever. Whatever the possession is, it's my responsibility. On the other hand, not to feel that the possession is fully mine, but rather like with the land is the example of the most important possession a person has in their lifetime. And in fact, we may have mentioned this, you are not required to make the pilgrimage 3 times a year to Jerusalem for the 3 festivals if you don't own land. Owning land is part of what makes you into a human being. Human beings need to have a connection to land. What does this say about living in a skyscraper? We're not going to get into right now, but in principle, a person needs to have a connection with the land. He needs to have a possession of real estate. Real estate makes you have a dwelling place in this world, in the same way that we say even God, who possesses the entire world, has to have a certain piece of real estate called the temple in Jerusalem. But it's complex. On the one hand, you have something that belongs to you and you're responsible for. On the other hand, don't think that it is completely 100% yours. First of all, because eventually we all pass away and we won't be remembered. Our possession of something will not be remembered. Maybe in the first temple period, there seemed to be, for at least 800 years, it seemed like there was some kind of perpetual remembrance that this plot of land belonged to this family. But eventually even that was washed away by history. And so, don't grow too attached to your possessions, even when it's real estate. Even in that case, you have to feel that the land, the world belongs to God. Now, this means a lot of things. I don't know if you remember, I think we were talking about something during Corona. And I said that one of the most important lessons that we can learn from Corona was that even though we have responsibility for how the world is not ours, in the sense that there are certain things that are beyond our control. Trying to control everything eventually leads to more mayhem and more problems than acknowledging the fact that in the end the world belongs to God. And as much responsibility as He has put upon us as human beings, we don't have total responsibility. We can't get into a state in which we feel that somehow the entire weight of the world is on our shoulders, because it's not. This is part of what this means, that you need to think about the world in a complex way. You need to think about your possessions in a complex way. So on the one hand, you have responsibility. On the other hand, not the entire weight of everything is on you. First of all, because you won't be here in so many years. Other people will take possession of what you had. But more importantly than that, even now, especially when there are extreme situations, you cannot take care of everything. That's not the human purpose. The human purpose is we are sojourners and temporary dwellers on the land that belongs to God. With this in mind, I want to take one small look at, there's a very interesting book that was written in the Middle Ages. We don't exactly know who the person was who wrote it. His name is Yedaya Hapnini, which seems to be a pseudonym and doesn't sound like a real name. And he wrote an interesting book called Mifchar Pninim, or the choice pearls, or the choice gems of thought. And he writes, most of the things that he writes were very hard to understand because they didn't seem to fit the way that we usually think about things. It was kind of like really out there for Jewish thought. So let's read this piece from him. He writes like this. He says, "Said the wise man, despair from that which people possess is the true aggrandizement of man." Aggrandizement in Hebrew is the word hitpa'arut. Tiferet means beauty. Hitpa'arut means to aggrandize something. You could say to beautify it. So he says the beauty of something is the despair that people that possess it have of it. Meaning, it's like the crown on top of my possessions is the fact that even though I own them, I despair from them. Now, it's not despair that I'm, again, shedding my responsibilities. Just knowing that as much as this is mine right now, it really ultimately belongs to God, not to me. And then he continues, so basically what is he saying? He's saying that despair is sometimes a good thing. You have to have some amount of despair in your life. In fact, you can almost think about it homeopathically, that when you take something that's negative, and I don't remember what the word in homeopathy is, but they dilute it again and again and again. If you take despair and you take the diluted form of despair, which is really not despair, it's not like the person's in depression at all, but he feels that there is a limit to how much this belongs to me. There is a limit. I'm willing to fight for my belongings, I'm willing to take care of them and so on, but in the end I know that it's not mine. That little bit, that diluted form of despair, is the crown on top of all my possessions. It's like I'm adding the presence of godliness on my possessions. And he continues, for avarice is poverty, resignation is liberty, and hope is slavery. Again, these are hard things to understand because, what, are you telling me I shouldn't have hope? Of course you should have hope. But sometimes having hope, in the sense that I will hold on to this forever, is something that causes a person to become a slave to something he should have let go of a long time ago. So you have to know how to use this attachment that we have to our belongings. You have to do it the right way. And if you do it the right way, and you have temperance, and you have that diluted amount of despair from holding on to it forever, in that case it becomes the crowning achievement of living in the world. Thanks for joining today. Hope to see you tomorrow.